Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas presents CNBC TV18, The Thought League Season 3, A Glorious Decade, A Century of Service.
Hello and welcome to Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas presents CNBC TV18, The Thought League Season 3. In this episode, we explore one of the most fundamental forces shaping any thriving democracy and economy, trust. From the relationship between citizens and the state to how businesses earn their social license to operate, trust underpins constitutional values, economic aspirations, and everyday ethics. And in a world of growing complexity and regulation, how do we restore and strengthen this essential foundation? To help us unpack this, we are honored to be joined by Honorable Justice D.Y. Chandrachud, former Chief Justice of India, whose judicial philosophy has long championed the values of inclusion, accountability, and fairness. We also have Mr. Cyril Shroff, Managing Partner of Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas, a leading voice in shaping India's legal and regulatory discourse. Gentlemen, thanks both of you for being with us here today. Let's begin this conversation on trust and the rule of law and why they matter more now than ever. Justice Chandrachud, if I can start with you from a constitutional perspective, sir, how do you view the role of trust in strengthening the relationship between the state and its citizens, especially in a democracy as diverse as India?
Individuals, whether they are citizens or businesses, move to the court when there's a problem at hand. Either their rights have been violated or there's an apprehended encroachment on their civil rights, or for that matter, when there's a violation of the criminal law. Now, creation of the trust in citizens is crucial for courts as judicial institutions, because citizens, and when I say citizens, that would also include other non-citizen actors who move court, are consumers of justice. And to create that sense of faith in the ability of the institution to generate positive and clear outcomes, that element of trust, A, in the decision makers, and B, institutionally, is crucial in any constitutional democracy like ours. We are a diverse society. We are a plural society. And therefore, inclusion, accountability, and transparency, these are key elements in the creation of trust. And if you look at our Constitution, the Constitution has sufficient guidance, whether it's in terms of the fundamental rights we have created in terms of Part 3 of the Constitution, or the fundamental duties in Part 4 of the Constitution, the directive principles of state policy in Part 4 of the Constitution, which in that sense undergird this whole notion of trust. Because trust is the very foundation of why people come to court in the first place, why businesses come to court in the first place. And therefore, we have to create conditions in which, in a diverse society like ours, multilinguistic, multilingual, multicultural, multireligious, with different geographical conditions across the length and breadth of the country, our institutions are capable of generating that trust.
Mr. Shroff, when legal or regulatory frameworks become overly complex or punitive, what are some of the institutional consequences you observe in terms of trust and legitimacy erosion?
So first, let me start by saying that trust is the lubricant for business and for progress. And I think without trust, there is going to always be a lot of friction in terms of how either the state deals with the citizen and vice versa, or citizens deal between themselves inter se as well. So restoration of trust, I think, is critical. There is no denying the fact that there is a trust deficit, both ways, between the citizen and the state, and between the state and the citizen. And that is what leads to complexity. What does it lead to? It leads to complex laws, which are drafted in a very convoluted way, and you don't know what the intention is, because we always toggle between principle-based law and regulation and rule-based as well. And there is always very often almost an invisible rule of something. If it is not caught in item A, B, C, D, there's an invisible E which will catch you. So therefore, the citizen does not fully trust the intent of the state, and vice versa. The state feels very often that a lot of the citizens, not all of them, a lot of the citizens are always trying to find loopholes around the law, and kind of tick the box, but to violate the spirit of the law as well. So there is this never-ending loop of trust deficit, which someday has to be broken. And how will that come? I think it will come firstly by more clearer drafting. I think there has to be a philosophical articulation of, are we going the principle based route, or are we going by the rule based route, or what combination of it? Secondly, I think on the same complexity point, I think we should not have criminal consequences for what are essentially civil situations. There are a lot of laws which micromanage the citizen. For example, you cannot keep your shop open after a particular time as well. Now, this should be left to bylaws. This should not be, and then they carry consequences as well. So the trivialization of a lot of regulation to very minor levels is again what creates friction, and it creates incentives to circumvent as well. That's the second part. And I think the third aspect, which is where I think the judiciary comes in, is there should be, through a set of reforms, there has to be speedy justice as well. Anything which takes 15, 20 years to resolve essentially is disheartening, and the citizen loses trust.
Justice Chandrachud, several judicial and legislative efforts today aim to simplify compliance and reduce criminalization of economic offences. Is enough being done, and where are we in this process?
Before we deal with the criminal aspect, I mean, the Income Tax Act is a clear example where, the recent finance bill, which was eventually converted into an act, attempted to simplify, the number of provisions in the law, the number of words in the law, the number of explanations in the law, the provisos of the law. And I think there's a great need now in India to spread this beyond fiscal governance, to make laws far more simple, understandable, because that's the first step. A citizen who wants to comply with the law, or a business which wants to comply with the law, must know what the law is, shorn of its complexity, and without having to go to lawyers or a team of lawyers for that matter. Now, well, of course, there are experts like Cyril's team is, but a citizen must know the law in a saral sense. I'm using the Hindi expression of a saral law. A subtle law which is easy to understand, because if it is easy to understand, it will be easy of compliance. If the law itself is complex to understand, it will be complex of compliance. So it must begin with the drafting of laws. The drafting of laws, particularly in the areas of economic governance, must make for more simplicity. And if we do that, that will be a very important first step in demystifying and the decomplexification of law, and particularly in the area of economic governance.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. Mr. Shroff, could you reflect on the importance of moving sort of away from fear-based regulation to a more principle-based, calibrated enforcement model? What would that shift require, both from regulators and businesses?
Absolutely. And just on the saral word, I think that it's an acronym really for simple, accessible, rational, and actionable. That was sort of invented. There is literature on this as well, on what are saral laws as well. So I think that's a good guide for in terms of how laws should be framed. Now, on the trust, on the issue of how do we create trust, I think we already discussed simplification. I think we should be discussing decriminalization and decomplexification as well. But I think there is work to be done on the citizen or on the governed side as well, because it's a vicious circle where the citizen or the person who's supposed to comply with it should not always have the mindset of trying to find a loophole or try to evade the law. Trust is a two-way process. Trust cannot be built for the state to, or the regulators to trust you. You have to show you have to demonstrate behaviors. Largely, we know it's not ever going to be perfect, but if you have consistent breaches of trust, then naturally the laws are going to be complex as well. So it's like you're sort of the two parts. We have to walk to each other and create trust. And I think it's a very important journey because there's always a bit of pele aap. You trust me, then I'll trust you. So somebody has to break that. And I actually think that the state should take the first step. And the Income Tax Act is a very good example of where the finance minister, in her speech, as well as has demonstrated that we are going to trust you until you prove us wrong. Otherwise, then of course there'll be consequences that we follow. So I think that's a great first step. But I think this principle should be extended to a lot of other laws as well, whether it's FEMA or whether it's company law rules or whether it's public market disclosures, SEBI rules as well. There's a whole slew of laws which affect business, many of which are premised on I don't trust you. So, and I think that creates unnecessary regulatory friction and regulatory cholesterol, which cannot ever be good for business.
Well, that's extremely insightful conversation, and we'll do more of it. But I had to take a quick commercial break here, so allow me to do that. Back with Justice Chandrachud and Mr. Shroff.
Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas presents CNBC TV18, The Thought League Season 3, A Glorious Decade, A Century of Service.
Welcome back to Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas presents CNBC TV18, The Thought League Season 3. We increasingly hear the term social license to operate in the context of corporate governance. So in legal terms, how should businesses approach trust building with stakeholders beyond statutory compliances?
So I think first and foremost, they should get their mindset right. And I think the mindset right is they should not treat the right to do business as a kind of almost like a birthright that they have. They have a social, you use the word, they have a social license to operate. And Professor Colin Meyer, who is a very famous philosopher, a legal philosopher as well, who has studied corporation, said that the role of a corporation is to produce profitable solutions for solving problems of people. So the moment the profit is an outcome, it's a side effect. Your social license to operate. Nobody has the fundamental right to operate anything. I mean, in its strictest theory, all rights belong to the state, and it is licensed. The state or the society has actually licensed them one by one to a corporation. The joint stock company was created on that basis, and the joint stock company, once it was licensed, brought a social license on certain conditions to pursue certain activities, whether it's making cars or whether it's selling software or whether it's selling medicines as well. These are not birthrights. These are social licenses that have been given, and therefore, and that license continues till such time as you're behaving yourself and you're playing by the rules. The moment you start, violating the rules and commit breaches, that effectively that social license gets taken away. So, for business, private sector to build and deserve that trust, they have to play by the rules and be ethical, and to make sure that it's not all about profit. It is also about stakeholder governance. India has done well in that respect.
Justice Chandrachud, from a judicial standpoint, how does consistent enforcement of contracts and voluntary compliance shape the broader trust fabric between private parties in a rule of law society?
When any private business, whether big or small, moves the court, you move the court with an expectation that there would be a just solution, a predictable solution, and a transparent and objective solution. Now, to create that sense of trust, courts have a very vital role in perpetuating this culture of objectivity, of transparency in decision making, and the application of consistent standards. Because litigation should not be a lottery. Litigation should be based on a set of assumptions in regard to a likely outcome, which a good legal professional, or for that matter, a business, would structure into the process. The problem occurs when that sense of predictability, of consistency is lost. And that really affects the trust of the citizen completely. And in that sense, really, I just also again want to emphasize this, that there is a very close connect between the maintenance of business ethics and economic growth. And courts, by applying these standards, whether, say, standards in the areas of environmental governance or standards relating to consumer safety or product safety, standards in relation to employee welfare, These are not standards in that sense which are restraints on business, but they ensure that as we move more and more into a market-based economy, as India is moving towards, that element of trust is preserved also by business and not just an expectation of business in the decision makers in courts. Courts, therefore, in that sense, have a very important role in creating conditions where the social aspects of good business are maintained, and in that sense, creating an atmosphere where the average citizen has trust in the ability of business to discharge their expectations as well. Courts are not always right, but the fact that they use processes such as hearings which are transparent, decisions which are reasoned, and the application of standards which are well known to the law, they generate that trust. I'm not saying that courts always are right, because after all, the process of decision making in courts is also a human process. But you have methods and remedies to correct an erroneous decision. But in the way you work as courts, you can create that element of trust on both sides of the consumption of justice by businesses as well as the citizens at large, on whose lives businesses operate increasingly.
I think very well explained, Justice Chandrachud. You know, how do you see, Justice Chandrachud, the role of everyday ethics in governance and jurisprudence, especially when laws themselves may be silent or ambiguous?
Well, actually, to my mind, we have to move now towards creating conditions where we trust citizens to comply with the law. The wages of non-compliance must not be in terms of the fear which you create in the minds of citizens. Once that first step is taken by new legislation or by new policies, then it's equally for citizens to respond by creating or justifying the trust which the law has placed in them. And really, the courts, in that sense, are these mediators, in these disputes between citizens and the state, or between business and the state, or for that matter, between two businesses. And I think for courts themselves, we create a level playing field in the entire process of dispute resolution by sending out a clear message that, on the one hand, if you say have a foreign investor and a domestic investor, there'll be a level playing field in the court. Nobody will have a better chance of, succeeding merely because of the nationality which you command. And therefore, these intrinsic areas of decision making by the courts send out a very positive message that this is a system which is wedded to the rule of law, and it applies the same yardstick to everyone in the process of decision making. That's critical to the maintenance of trust.
Absolutely. Mr. Shroff, as a legal advisor to many leading corporations, how do you encourage the integration of ethical frameworks into business decision making, not just as good practice, but as a foundation for enduring trust?
So this is a little bit like the invisible hand that Adam Smith talks about in terms of how business works. And ethics, which is a fundamental part of creating of trust, is that invisible hand. It's the people don't properly understand the actual cost that you pay of lack of trust and the lack of ethics in terms of, say, whether it's a real estate transaction or it's just any commercial deal in terms of how you're buying goods and services as well. If there is an underlying presumption of ethics, you know that even if you forgot to write something in the contract, that the principle of it would be honored. Why do we write to 100-page contracts? Because of lack of trust. In theory, if there was complete trust between the parties, once the handshake is done, you can have a contract of one page. The economic cost of lack of ethics and lack of trust is enormous. And actually, my profession largely thrives on the basis of a presumption of lack of trust between dealing parties in commercial situations. And that adds a lot of cost and cholesterol to the smoothness with which business is done. So I actually think that everyday ethics or ethics is a fundamental basis of creating trust. If I trust you and you trust me, you don't need anything more than that. I mean, the old, as they say, Jaban de diya. And I think that, and then everything else follows as a matter of fact. Why do we need such long, complicated frameworks in order to govern our behavior? If this happens, if that happens, you actually don't need it if there is trust as well. So, but it's that being said, we're living in a modern society. We're living in a complex society, so it's never going to be perfect. But you can certainly bring down disputes. You can certainly bring down the economic cost of of doing business between private citizens as well as between a private citizen and state, or between companies and state, just by infusing a heavy dose of ethics. Ultimately, it's a matter of conscience as well. Things must smell right for them to, and in very often when we advise clients, we apply, and this is quite a well-known folklore in the form of the 4-box matrix, which is there are using Hindu mythology, there is the Rama box, which is correct in form and substance and principles. Then there is the Krishna box, which is right in substance, but can be a little dodgy on form. Then there is the Duryodhan box, which is kind of right on form, but utterly wrong on principle and substance. And then there is the Ravan box, which is wrong in form and in substance, run away with somebody's life, things like that. So what we try to do in terms of how we advise, and I think how business should look at it, is try your best to be in the Rama box, by default be in the Krishna box, but don't go anywhere below that. And I think once you are achieving that, then I think you will be able to there will be much greater compliance in principle, as well as you will create much more trust. This is, according to me, my personal definition of ethics.
No, I think that's such a wonderful way to describe it, and I think all of us can learn from it. That brings us to an end of a very, very thought-provoking episode of the Thought League, where we examine the essential role of trust in strengthening India's legal, economic and social fabric. A heartfelt thanks to you, Honorable Justice D.Y. Chandrachud and Mr. Shroff, for your valuable insights on how trust between the state and citizens, between businesses and society can rebuild through thoughtful legislation, ethical leadership and judicial foresight. Until next time, stay informed, stay inspired and keep leading with trust.
Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas presents CNBC TV18, The Thought League Season 3, A Glorious Decade, A Century of Service.